Hello, and welcome to Within and Beyond. And I am your host, Lorraine Appleyard. And today I have a very interesting guest to speak with. He has a very long history of spiritual life, spiritual living. It began when he was born and raised on a dairy farm. He had early life premonitions, dreams at about 6 years of age. And these dreams were of people that were passing over. Of course, like many people with spiritual visions, he was not understood by his family. And as a result, he held those visions within and didn't bring it up again until in about his mid-30s. At that time, Spirit was ramping up his intuition and he was having more visions of people passing over. Finally, he found a spiritual teacher in the early 1990s. That seems like a long time ago now, as we're living in the 2026s, but so he's been on his spiritual journey for a long time. And during that time, he worked with the spiritual teacher for about 15 years. He's been on a personal journey for the last 20, growing and evolving. He feels his past lives are very much connected with this current time, and that he has come to help Earth here in a transition period into a more evolved path. And I would like to introduce to you Reuter. Thank you very much for joining me today to talk, Roy. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. We talked about how you've had some early life premonitions as a child. Do you want to describe some of those for me, for us, for the audience?
Well, the first one was I had a sister who passed away when I was 6, and I kept dreaming about a car crash over and over. And like I said, I was about 6 at the time. And finally, I couldn't take it anymore, for me, and I went and said something to her. And I remember her giving me a look, her eyes bugged out and everything like this. And this was in like August. And in early December of that year, she was in a car crash with my cousin, cousin's boyfriend, and another young lady, and they all died together in that car crash. And I couldn't talk to anybody at the time. I'd say things and people give me odd looks. I couldn't share it. But yet that I was told by another teacher I had as an encounter that was a kind of an awakening for me. It came along that was set up to get me moving in this direction. And I still had other premonitions in between, feelings, not necessarily all dreams, but just knowings and stuff come along and things like that.
Now, I'm just going to validate something for you also, because you said that you were informed by a spiritual teacher that particular premonition and that experience, I mean, it's devastating, but that it acted as a sort of an awakening process for you to have you move deeper into the mysteries. That's how I like to call it, the mysteries. And as a young person, I had many premonitions. I was in tune with my spiritual teachers at the time in spirit, and I didn't fully understand everything then, but as I've been able to walk this path, I understand that many people have such profound experiences with visions and then loss of loved ones, and it's meant to awaken us to put on our path.
Yes. And it opened doors for other things that were happening at the same time, too. I started having an ET connection at that point, too. And I would just have this feeling like they were going to be coming for me at night, when I was just young like that. And I just, I didn't have anybody to talk to about it. So I just kind of like went with the flow. But later on, I wasn't fearful and about that.
Now that's interesting because as a young person, I also had connections with ET sort of concepts. Very similar to how you described it. You said you felt that they were coming for you at nighttime. So that's interesting. To me, I relate to that as having an awareness of higher consciousness or beings of higher consciousness. That's how I relate to that now. Now, you and we've touched upon some very interesting conversations in the past about Atlantis. And I know that I had a vision and a knowing around Atlantis very spontaneously as a young person. And the conversation that I had with you was kind of like one of those conversations that just send shockwaves throughout your being.
Sure.
Tell me about your remembering of Atlantis.
Well, I have vision of me being there with my wife and my daughter at the time. And Atlantis wasn't destroyed by a earth type flood. This was it was a cleaning of the slate so we could start over to get to this point where we are now. And Atlantis needed to be taken out, wiped out. So there was ET were involved in the destruction of Atlantis. They wanted to clean the slate and start over, and they learned too because they couldn't get us to cross the line into, like, a lot of times people now are talking about transitioning fifth dimensional energy beingness. There was too much negative going on, and this had to happen. And I was there as in the leadership, and I just remember being buried by rocks and all this other stuff because they were coming in to do this. We knew it was coming.
So from your remembering, your soul remembering, you say it was a higher life form that destructed Atlantis?
Yes. They were assisting in a way more open way with Atlantis than they are now. They're assisting more from behind the scenes now. And we had in the leadership of Atlantis, we had connections with those beings all the time, where there was but there was different groups that were misusing some of the abilities we had at that time to create negative things. And they actually called them things, and they didn't have free will. They were created without free will. And this is why free will is so important in this path.
Well, you're right about that, about free will being more very important in spiritual life, or in our human life. And I believe that free will, the concept of that, has been lost and perhaps misconstrued. Now, I want to go back to this a little bit because as a young person, as I was saying, I would receive guidance from my teachers in spirit. And when I was a kid, there was a cartoon called Atlantis with Aquaman. I don't know if you were okay. Yeah. And so, as a kid, we would act out, our favorite superheroes type of thing. And I remember like playing and thinking of Atlantis. I was always in my room by myself. And suddenly I had this wave come over me, and that Atlantis was real.
Mm,
And it was, and I was only young. I was only probably about 8 at the time. And I remember thinking, where did that sense come from? Like I
yes.
had no idea, but it was, of course, very um, formative for me having that experience. And I didn't share it with anyone. Now, but what's interesting, of course, is that Atlantis has been talked about throughout the ages. There was the philosopher Plato that spoke about Atlantis, and a lot of spiritual paths have arisen from this point in history. So I find that very interesting. And I also will reflect upon how you were talking about these higher beings that ultimately destroyed Atlantis because of the misuse of power. Now, to me, there are always higher beings that are present in the background of our this sphere, this construct that we call Earth or the world, because we're interwoven with different layers of reality or beingness. Of course, Earth being the denser layer, the material form. But then we have the spiritual, the astral, the mental, the spiritual spheres that overlap this. And I believe that always there is a hand that is guiding our evolution here on Earth. And and so sometimes when we see destruction happening, and we can cry and bemoan and talk about how the destruction of what we are seeing in our material world is terrible, there exists a higher purpose behind it. And that spiritual beings are it's bringing things into alignment.
I totally agree with that. Actually, a lot of those spiritual beings, we exist in multi dimensions at different
Yes.
vibrations, and some of those other beings we're involved with are higher vibrational versions of ourself,
Mm.
and we're here assisting our lower vibrational self to make it through this path. You know, uh, that's just the way I see it.
And and that is how I see it, although sometimes words, different traditions and different philosophies have different wording to describe the same thing, right?
Correct.
And I feel that sometimes that's where some of the disconnect occurs with some of the teachings, particularly with some of the neo spirituality. People get some of the people get snippets or concepts of it and might get off the track for what that path is, if you follow me, because the wordings, how we choose the wordings, we're talking about the same thing, but we may be understanding it from a different direction or perspective. And so we get lost. I guess it's really, when you think about it, it's very much the conundrum of the human experience that we get lost in words and thoughts because of the position that we're coming from. But we very often can be talking about a similar or the same experience. But I like how you were talking about the interdimensional aspect. And that's very true. And so what we see here on the physical world is the densest of realities, but we're not able to perceive or be attuned to the more subtle forces that are working with us. And this can mean, well, I just felt guided to say this can mean both the positive forces and the negative forces that are out there, because we have to understand that where there's light, there's darkness. And if we believe in higher dimensional light beings, it only serves to be true that there are also lower dimensional beings that want to hold back things. What are your feelings on that?
Well, we all have light and dark within ourselves. That's we're always looking to maintain balance within ourselves, and that's what those light and dark beings' purposes are within the whole of everything. Is to so we got that difference to work out, and that's where we learn from. That's how we evolve and grow. A lot of people see Earth as a very dense, negative place, but it's really, we are blessed to be in this environment to learn and grow from. It's unique in the universe. There are other places similar to it, but it's not common out there. But it is. We're more highly evolved, and that's why we get the opportunity to come here. And some people might not feel like they've had that. They don't they don't understand why they're here. Some people don't want to come back, and I understand some of their frustration. But we choose our path before we are born. We
Yes.
set this down, and we don't over there. We don't fully understand it, because of the disconnect. And then we come here, and then the veil is drawn, and we forget that connection over there. And then when we experience here in the third dimension, everything can be quite a challenge. But that's the point of it.
Exactly. And I do agree with you in that concept that essentially Earth is a training ground for our souls to grow. And sadly, unfortunately, we grow very much through our shadows. But if I look at this through the lens of alchemy, which is the traditional way that the mysteries were understood, that we go through an alchemical process where we are burned away. We are, those lower aspects are burned away and transmuted to gold. That is literally the concept of alchemy. But you've described it in a way that can be understood to the average thinker that, hey, I'm taking this beating here in this world at this time. I'm enduring all of these shadows and darkness because there's an aspect of me that is going to be refined as a result of this.
Absolutely. Yes. I've had conversations in the last couple of days. One is my sister. She went through big changes in life for herself, physically, emotionally, spiritually, all three levels. But she sees that, very, very much of a test for her. But now she uses all that experience to help others with, and she sees it as a blessing. And I feel that way too about a lot of my experiences. Without them, I couldn't be who I am now. And I think that's true for anybody, but I still understand when people say they feel frustrated by the experience here, but it's part of trusting your path. You might be on a path that isn't looking so good, but you got to trust it. You got to trust why you came here, why you got to trust your higher self for making these choices for you. And sometimes you can make a mistake and create what they call karma here for yourself. But maybe that's just a way of saying, I just want to learn this in a deeper way.
Well, I love the way that you describe that, because in the way that you describe it, it takes away all aspect of judgment and blame. And because we like to judge here in this very world of duality, right? We see things only as good as bad. And so I like the way that you are highlighting that. Now, you touched on something. Let me see if I can go back to that to elaborate on that. Okay. So the key is here really, because you were talking about, trusting and having faith, but the key is really is that in order to do this, in order to trust and have faith, I believe that for a lot of individuals that are truly struggling, that they have not recognized or understood that they are indeed spiritual beings having a human experience.
I can
I
agree with
feel
that.
yes, because the first step for me, and what you described also about the sum of all of your experiences making who you are, which is wonderful and true, and that how you're able to help others travel through their darkness, through their journey. That's beautiful. And to me, I also feel that is actually what we're meant to do, that we're all to be of service to one another in some way, shape, or form.
Exactly. Exactly.
However we view this journey or this world, that we all are meant to help one another. And that's really, it opens up the heart just when you think about that. For me, it does. And it broadens and embodies love itself. So, and I think that when we are able to shift from from the perspective of why is this happening to me, but rather, what is life trying to teach me?
Exactly. And you brought up a thing before about, I refer to it as guilt and shame. I believe those are wasted emotions because they hold you back from learning. And I
Mm-hmm.
see so many people, you know, um, feeling guilty about somehow being victimized, you know, here, that they blame themselves for being a victim. And that
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't get you anywhere. It holds you back. And, you know, got to let go of that self judgment. And that's a huge part of what's going on in this world today.
Yeah, you're absolutely right that a lot of times people just sort of focus on that lack, and really it's self-persecution, really. It itself is a form of self-hatred, really, now that you're talking about that. And you're right, because I feel that that is what holds a lot of individuals back in their level of consciousness. Because I like to approach things from, it's a fusion of mysticism, spirituality, and modern psychology. And to me, modern psychology is just the fruits or the studies of ancient truths brought to current understanding. But modern psychology would talk about that, the need for self-love. And when we can look at these things that hold us back, like guilt, shame, lack of self-esteem, um, then these are the aspects that hold us back. But so I'm going to touch upon something also. As we're saying this, because a lot of times this guilt that we suffer from, or lack of esteem, it really comes from the fact that we're conditioned or indoctrinated by this material world. A lot of mystics call it being asleep, right?
Yes, a lot of it is indoctrination, judgment put on us by other people when you are not you're the victim, but they judge the victim. And I see a lot of this. I see this as big part. It's in both sexes, the male and the female. We
Hmm.
mentioned earlier about the divine feminine stepping forward. It's especially prevalent within the females with being judged
Okay,
negatively
so
for.
now, absolutely, you're absolutely right. And now I'm just feeling this wave coming up through me from my sacral chakra, and I know that I want to talk more about the divine feminine more. but I'm going to touch upon that just a little bit more because we're talking about the modern world and how it's viewed, the woman, the female, um,
Correct.
in some of the more recent history. And that is where some of this judgment and victimization comes from, is that women have really been cast down in our modern society. I do feel that there's a resurgence coming back, but we're talking about the divine feminine. So let's just get into that a little bit more.
Well, I definitely, it's been happening for thousands of years. It was largely promoted by religion, where they segregated, and that was the culture back then. Women were always like second or third class. And I was just talking to my wife, and I was saying, when we first got married, we borrowed money for our first house, and at that time, she couldn't legally get a loan by herself. She had to have me
My
with
mom
her.
couldn't either. Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
thinking, wow. But I mean, it goes back thousands of years, and women have been, getting the right to vote all along the way. This emergence of the divine feminine has been going on for a long time, but it's accelerated recently in the heat of the transition. We're in the heat of the transition right now. And there's so many women that are coming forward speaking of, and I see this with that, and it's very important. And it totally fits with that message I was given a long time ago, like it's 25 years now or so. And I just never said anything about it, but I've been talking about it now recently in the last years, because it's coming forward, where they're standing up for themselves, and they're saying, this is, this, I shouldn't have had this happen to me. I shouldn't have been abused or whatever, or, not recognized for my abilities and stuff like this. That used to be very common with, scientists and doctors and stuff like this. Women were very
We're cast down.
much into, doing things,
Yeah.
but yet they wouldn't give them credit back 100 years ago,
Yes. So how I liken that is that we've lived in a patriarchal society where women have has been viewed as lesser beings, essentially. And you're right, it did come from religious teaching. Some of the interpretations of teachings of scriptures have been vastly patriarchal. And unfortunately, what's happened is that a lot of these feminine aspects have been cast aside because it was simply part of the times, that the masculine was the strong, they're out there conquering, they were out there, creating, and the feminine, the females were no longer viewed as having anything to contribute. But yeah, if you look at some societies, ancient societies, the females were revered and were consulted, and in fact maybe have had a higher position than in some societies than the man did. And so it's really this current sort of civilization that has constructed this, and now we're seeing, as in your words, the divine feminine coming back. We're seeing a reclaimance of this feminine aspect. And to me, I understand it as this. In ancient texts and ancient philosophies, it's the divine male and the divine female that have to be united together in order to be whole. And and so that's within one's own self, but there's the macrocosm too, and that it has to be that in our physical world also, which is why I believe we're seeing a lot of collapses of systems now, because they were built solely on the masculine concept.
I agree with that. You know, it's like we go back to Mary Magdalene. I remember her. I was raised a Catholic, and I remember I would sit in church and hear her called a prostitute, and she never really was. And I remember sitting in church when they came out and said she wasn't. I was still a child, but it was really like, this is like, I feel the Catholic Church changed their mind because of the esoteric writings that are within the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they knew this stuff was going to come out someday, and they were looking to change the profile, and they had to open the doors for women along the way. And I think that's a lot of what's been happening, like I'm talking about, for them to vote and everything, but it's all been very, very slow.
Yeah, so in that respect, what you're talking about, she was cast down to be and depicted as a prostitute, but there was, see, a lot of I know the biblical teachings, it's been lost because of the way these interpretations have occurred. There's been different language, and of course, it's a dead language, and so it's been interpreted through the lens of different meanings, but it's not actually the way it was meant to be interpreted. So
it wasn't the message of Jesus.
It wasn't
and Mary Magdalene, because it was a joint message. You know, he was her number one apostle.
She was his number one apostle. Yes, she was.
Without each other, the truth of what he was here about couldn't happen. They complemented each other.
And how they complemented each other, how I have come to understand this, which is, I know this is how Spirit has worked through me, is that divine balance of the feminine and masculine. So if Jesus was the embodiment of the masculine deity and she was the embodiment of the female divinity, you need both in order to have wisdom, and she was the wisdom. So he would bring through these teachings, and then she would then in a way decipher it through her wisdom, through her. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Well, they lived the example. You know, that's the strongest thing you can give to anybody. You can talk words, but your energy and your example are the greatest thing you can do to help other people. And people will sense and feel that, and they'll respond to that. And I think that's a lot of what they did together. You know, but there is writings out there from Mary Magdalene and stuff like that, and some of these, I've seen some of these things.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they have done a lot to bring things to light. Now, I know that, again, we look at the consciousness of the era when these were being translated and interpreted. And if we look at the consciousness of the era there, it was certainly man was going through a period of darkness. And it very much was about repentance, and very much was about sin and the sinful nature of man. Not necessarily just a man, but mankind, all of humanity. And so Mary then was sort of made to be that symbol of, well, she was a prostitute, but she redeemed herself. And this is redemption, what redemption can look like. But she was never a prostitute. It was the translation of one of these words that had then was latched onto, and then they depicted this as, well, redemption. But ultimately, what happened is that it cast aside a fundamental truth of the scriptures, of the teachings, because that wisdom, that Sophia, wasn't recognized. And I think that this is really where a lot of anger towards the church comes from nowadays, is that there has been misteachings, perhaps, or...
Well, the men feared powerful women back then more than they do today. There's a lot more men that can accept a woman being intelligent and having a large role in anything in society, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. But back then, it was very, very hard. Jesus came and he disrupted that whole deal between, well, Jesus and Mary Magdalene came and disrupted the whole deal. You know, even I fall back into my old programming, if you want to put it that way, with the, you know, the male being the number one, but the male ain't the number one, and the female ain't the number one. They're both equal parts of the whole, and that's what we need.
Yeah. And how I view it as, so over tradition, over history, it's like woman's work is domestic work, and the man's work is sort of out in the world, and therefore women can't go out in the world to work. But how I see it, to me, the family unit, having someone keeping the hearth and keeping that fire going and looking and looking after one another and nourishing mind, body, and spirit, to me, that's the role of what some might call tradition. But what's lacking is the understanding or the depth of what that role brings. That there's actual, it's not that they can't go out, it's that there's real purpose and value to keeping that hearth flame burning at home. That's how I look at it. And
I agree with you on that. Yes. You know, but you know, a lot of people today want to take and push us back a couple thousand years, in that, you know, not having free choice, free will. You know, that a lot of that is they want it a certain way, and they can't accept it if it's different than.
So I'm going to just take that even a step further. And we talk about how teachings have been misconstrued based on the consciousness at the time. When we talk about free will and a woman being able to make choice, is that what you're talking about there specifically?
Correct.
So I believe that it does come from the sense of patriarchy, but it comes from the misconception, because I do believe that there's a seed of truth that runs through things, but it can get misconstrued of not seeing through a pure lens. And to me, it is looking at or being able to view that all life is to be precious and revered. I do believe that that's truth, but I don't believe that two things cannot also be true, if you know what I mean.
I know what you
all
mean.
Life, right? Because we're, again, living this human experience, and we have these circumstances that we must be able to live and move through, because this is what our soul, our being, is experiencing in order to grow. And if you look back in time, there have always been wise women that have been able to make a concoction in order to be able to induce a miscarriage. Just giving this information.
Yeah.
And to me, my point of view is if there was a knowledge of herbs back then, and to me, herbs are sacred. They have a sacred wisdom to them. And
Sure.
so if this existed on a very, natural level, then therefore it must be that there are circumstances where this is okay. Because it wouldn't exist in nature. The fundamental ability of that wouldn't exist in nature. Do you understand what I'm saying when I'm
I
saying it like
understand what
that?
you're saying. Yeah.
And so really, again, what this comes to is the uniting of the masculine and the feminine. And so whenever we get a pushback on one aspect or another, whether it be too much male or too much female,
Yeah.
then we create an imbalance. And it is about understanding the teachings or the esotericism as to the whys and the whats and the hows in order to be whole. Because ultimately, that's really what this battle is about. It's about, like you said, perfecting our soul and becoming whole, right?
Correct.
But we have a
when
lot
we
of. Go
when
ahead.
we come here from spirit and we enter this physicality, actually isn't reality. This is the illusion.
Right.
And we're coming here, like all the experiences we've been talking about today, we're coming here to have those different experiences. And they're serving a purpose by more than evolving our soul. We are all part of source of creation. Everything is one. But we are a source out there experiencing within this illusion of physicality. So source can experience everything it knows in a physical way because it knows everything, but it wants to experience it physically. So everything you're talking about, like the way the women with them doing this is part of an experience that's teaching us in our own evolvement of our soul. And each as individuals, when we go through that process, we're also purposely doing that because for love of source energy.
So I'm going to surmise that because I understand what you're talking about. And this also goes back to mystical ancient teachings that essentially what we're experiencing is source. We are the individuated aspects of source having this human experience. And as we have this human experience, you were talking about already knowing, but having the experience. Because what happens when you know something, but then you have the experience? You have wisdom.
You learn.
And so you learn. And now it doesn't become just intellectual, it becomes embodied wisdom. And this is what we're experiencing now, this embodiment of wisdom. And I'm going to circle back around. That is the divine feminine. That is the Sophia, the embodied wisdom. And that is the kernel of truth that has existed in the beginning of time. So what you've just stated really, I want people to understand is when they're having these experiences, it is for them to be able to use, to remember all of their beingness, their wholeness, and to have this experience so that they are embodied wisdom. So it's source experiencing itself, right?
Yes.
Having this experience.
Yes. Yep. Love that.
Well, it's kind of mind-blowing, but this is also why I have to say, this is also why ancient teachings, the mystical teachings or the esotericism, it can only be disseminated and understood when the time is right, because otherwise it can become really very ungrounding to have all of these concepts come through at once, I feel.
Misused, actually, and that's been part of the history of what's been happening. They didn't understand them, so they feared that knowledge or that knowing. So they did things to shut it down, and that's what happened to the divine feminine. It got shut down as much as possible. And then through time and, through all these different experiences, even through the witch burnings and everything like this, and men got burned too. But it was like when women would use herbs and stuff like that, a lot of times the religious people they would fear that as something negative, and they would burn them, and do nasty things like that.
The burning times, yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think that we have a lot more to talk about, Roy, going forward. I really would like to have the opportunity to talk more, because there's just so much that we are able to have a discussion on. And I believe that together, it's that masculine and feminine working together to be whole. So I thank you very much for your time today and having this discussion. And I look forward to speaking with you again where we can get down and unfold some more.
I very much enjoyed this forum to be able to communicate this out for people. And hopefully they see the value in this for themselves.
Yes, hopefully. And I would encourage those that are watching to watch it and to hear it with the ears of the soul, the ears of the heart.
Yes. Go inside.
Of how these words feel and land within your body, because it's not intellectual stuff.
No.
Thanks again, Roy, very much for the opportunity to talk with you. I look forward to chatting with you in future.
Thank you too. You're welcome. I'm grateful.
Bye for now.
Bye.